more stuff from WWDC. Hi, I'm Ken Ray, welcoming you into episode 190 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. A couple of weeks ago, we took a look at privacy and security features announced for the Mac at WWDC. Today, we'll look at a few announcements for iOS, including notification news with a side of what the heck is going on with Clipboard. Plus, we're taking biometrics on Safari. That's still iOS, isn't it? We'll talk it all over with Brett Terpstra, our guest for Checklist 190, brought to you by Secure Mac. Brett Terpstra is an author, a coder, and a web developer. He's written for a number of sites over the years, including Engadget, the unofficial Apple weblog, and Joystick, among others. He is an indie developer, and he was kind enough to talk over more WWDC privacy and security stuff this week with an eye on iOS. Hot on the heels of WWDC20. A couple of weeks ago, the guys from Secure Mac and I were talking about some of the privacy and security features that interested them in macOS, Big Sur, macOS 11, all of a sudden. And I wanted to talk about some of the stuff that we saw in iOS 14. I'm curious what security changes or features announced a couple of weeks ago grabbed your attention.
I guess what really grabbed me was the focus on transparency that they're kind of forcing onto third-party applications. Things like the recording light indicator and tracking agreements that you'll have to opt into. Clipboard access notifications, stuff like that. Really, it's always felt like Apple does a pretty good job with privacy, but they don't, despite having a walled garden, they don't take an iron fist with some of the developers. Mm-hmm. And I feel like they're making strides in that area with this.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like, those were some of the biggest changes announced. Notifications and permissions, not, permissions from a technical standpoint, but permissions in terms of, is this okay with you, the user? There was a piece from Wired that I read that said Apple's tracking controls will extend to iOS 14 more broadly. A version of its intelligent tracking prevention for Safari will give iPhone and iPad users more control over clandestine tracking, not just within the browser, but between apps. And then there was, one of the people from Apple, Katie Skinner, who is a user privacy software manager at Apple, said during the keynote, "We believe tracking should always be transparent and under your control. So moving forward, App Store policy will require apps to ask before tracking you across apps and websites owned by other companies." There is a thing that I wonder, though, and it sort of reminds me of like a lot of the privacy controls that you saw start turning up on websites. I have kind of a fear that it's going to be like the terms and conditions thing that we all, agree to without taking the time to read them. Is there a worry at all that people are just going to start clicking OK because we're going to get so many notifications like, hey, this is tracking you. Hey, this is tracking you every time you open an app or a website?
Yeah, I do think it becomes noise. No, anything repeated becomes noise. And you want to get past it to use the apps. But I think the corollary, more than with terms and conditions, would be the on Mac, do you want to send feedback to the developer pop-up that comes up. The first time you use an app, it asks for permission to send crash reports and usage data to the developer. And I think that comes up infrequently enough because it's just the first time you use an app, not every time you visit a website or anything. Comes up infrequently enough. And I think people that are at all concerned or don't know what it means would instinctively hit no. So it really is, you have to know that you're helping somebody out and you're doing a good thing to want to hit yes. Mm-hmm. And it seems safer to me.
Honestly, it took me a very long time. It was probably working with the guys from Secure Mac before I was finally like, okay, I'm going to share that information with the developers, because sharing information, that sounds like a euphemism for giving people access to stuff I don't want to give them access to.
Right. And I feel like a lot of those dialogues are poorly worded. Mm-hmm. Like in a lot of cases, there isn't even personal data attached to things like a crash report unless you volunteer your email address to it.
Right, right. There's you mentioned it a moment ago, the Clipboard notification thing. That has been the biggest notification issue so far. And to say biggest so far, I mean, I guess as we're talking, the iOS 14 beta has only been running for about a week and a half for developers, maybe 2.5 weeks. I lose track of time in these uncertain times.
Same.
Yeah, but it's only been less than 3 weeks, and yet we all know about the Clipboard thing. There was a Mac Rumors piece a couple of weeks back. TikTok users who upgraded to the iOS 14 beta quickly noticed constant alerts warning them that TikTok was accessing the Clipboard every few seconds. After being caught, TikTok now says that it's removing the feature. TikTok said they were doing it to detect and combat spammy behavior. LinkedIn, it turns out, was doing it. The answer that they gave may have made perfect sense to somebody like you, to a developer. Though developers, I don't think, were the ones you had to please at that point. Because I read it, and then I tried to look up online what it meant, and basically what it meant was they're copying your clipboard, and the answer that they gave was practically in binary. There are over 50 apps that we know about, running the gamut, different types of apps from, well, like I say, from LinkedIn to Weibo to, well, I can't say name it because there are millions of apps in the App Store, and we can only name 50. But what I'm wondering about, first of all, is, I mean, for the ones that said it was an accident, can you tell me in non-developer terms how that could have happened accidentally?
I have no idea how you would accidentally check the pasteboard. That's a very intentional move.
Okay.
Some apps like Deliveries, which checks for a tracking URL in your clipboard, or like Pixelmator, which checks for image data in your clipboard, those are very legitimate. When I open up Deliveries, I want it to automatically notice that I just copied a UPS tracking URL and automatically add that package. I appreciate that convenience. And when that notification pops up, it's like, yeah, of course. I haven't had none of the apps that I run regularly have had any surprising clipboard access notifications. I think I don't use a lot of these ones like LinkedIn. I didn't read their explanation, but I mean, there are legitimate reasons to access the clipboard. And in the case of checking for spammy behavior, if you were watching to see if someone was just copy pasting a status repeatedly, I could see that being considered a legitimate use. And I guess it depends on the privacy of the application itself. But in answer to your question, I can't imagine how one would accidentally check the clipboard. Okay.
The other thing, and I think this sort of goes to the question about notifications that we were talking about a minute ago, what I've not seen anybody say is what happens once the user is alerted. I mean, are they now able to say, hold on, TikTok, I don't want you accessing the clipboard? Or is the option to turn off access to the clipboard for TikTok, or is the option, well, they're copying your clipboard, so if you don't want to use it, or if you don't want them to do that, don't use TikTok?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I could be wrong because I haven't delved into all of the available settings, but I don't think there's a way to wholesale block access to the clipboard, and even less likely that there's a granular way to deny a single app access. I think the option is to just stop using the app, but it feels like something that Apple's eventually going to require devs to declare in the same way they do tracking now. Like to openly say this app uses clipboard access for this purpose and have that be revealed the same way that you declare your use of tracking.
We'll need another little icon because, of course, they have the microphone thing now that's lit up when it's recording. They have the little orange thing, I think, that's lit up when the camera's working. You have a little pencil going in the upper corner when it's copying off you.
Maybe that would flash on and off, though. The pasteboard check is such an instantaneous, it takes a millisecond to not just read it, but copy data from it. So, an indicator light wouldn't make a lot of sense. But the notifications as they stand now, the kind of banner that comes up, to let you know what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I have a ton of apps on my Mac that are always watching my clipboard. Like for me, copying different things causes different things to happen, and it's a beautiful way to handle automation. I would like that to be an option. I would like things that could use, like Gladys. You use Gladys?
No.
Basically, a clipboard manager for iOS.
Okay.
But it's way too manual, in my opinion, right now. The idea of having, especially on like an iPad Pro, having a clipboard that you could see a history in and select from, stuff like that would require constant clipboard watching across all apps. And I don't think that's ever going to happen, but it would be cool.
It's interesting. I mean, that's a real power user move, though. I mean, I wonder if what you're looking for instead of a notification every time, because it sounds like you actively want that. At my most paranoid, I actively don't want that. I mean, do we need graduated levels in a way? Like, okay, copy the last thing or allow the last thing, or I'm not a power user, I don't want this. But then that starts to mess up, the it just works mantra from iOS and macOS.
Well, and there's this difference between Mac and iOS in that iOS is very much, obviously, a mobile platform. So the idea of having something watching your clipboard very much insinuates that data is not staying on that it's going to some kind of cloud server, that it's going to something that interprets it, that it's not staying on your device. Whereas on Mac, I'm not worried at all. I don't automatically assume that something watching my clipboard is going to be sharing my data. But that is an easier leap to make on iOS.
In a moment, we're taking our faces on Safari. But first, a word about MacScan 3 from Secure Mac. For me, the Mac is perfect, though it is of course not a perfect machine. We used to think Macs were immune to malware. While that was never the case, malware for the Mac is more prevalent and more dangerous today than it's ever been before. Guard against that with MacScan 3 from Secure Mac. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by Secure Mac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your computer. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then once you decide to buy for less. You can take a little off your subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first, let it find and remove the bad stuff you've bumped into. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code CHECKLIST at securemac.com/MacScan. And now more of our conversation with Brett Terpstra. So I had a funny thing happen on macOS Ken recently about announcements for Safari. And what's weird is it didn't even occur to me until about a day ago that we would be talking about Safari on this show, but it's because of this trap that I fall into, and I think a lot of people fall into as well. They tend to think about announcements for Safari as announcements for the desktop. It's kind of like you were talking a moment ago about I'm not worried about certain things happening on my Mac that I do worry about happening on my iPhone. So when Apple said at WWDC that it was introducing a feature to let developers, work FaceID and TouchID authentication into websites, I had a listener or two write to me and say, how do you use FaceID on a Mac? And, that day's coming. But right now, of course, the real deal is you can put those on your site so that people can have them, have the most secure way to log in no matter what device they're on, right?
Yeah. You can't currently, like you said, it'll eventually happen. You can't use Face ID on a Mac, but you can use Touch ID on Touch Bar MacBook Pros, and that will work with this new login authentication API on Safari on Mac.
Like, okay, so when I'm at the grocery store, well, I'm wearing a mask now, so Face ID is no good to me. But back in the day, when I was at the grocery store and I wanted to check, I don't know, a balance on something to see whether I wanted to draw from, this source of revenue or that source of revenue. Do I want to go from my bank account, or do I want to go from another bank account? Basically, what's great is I didn't have to stand there and type in my username and password because the app had Face ID.
Right.
But my bank specifically, if I look at my app the wrong way, it will try 2 times in really quick succession and then tell me that I'm locked out of Face ID. Right. Yeah. So at that point, I have to go to the website. And this is where I want Face ID to work on the web, even when I'm out. And it took me thinking about that, like the worst problems that I've had with Face ID for apps, to realize this is not just a Mac thing. This is a Safari thing, and Safari is on your iPad, is on your iPhone, and is on your Mac.
Right.
Yeah. According to Apple's documentation on the Web Authentication API, like the app process, the upcoming Safari feature allows users to enable Face ID and Touch ID authentication after an old-school login that involves entering a username, password, and, if necessary, 2-factor credentials. Website owners can opt to display a pop-up notification that invites users to default to biometric authentication when next visiting the site. I'm curious, without saying anything you're not allowed to say, do you have any idea how easy this is going to be? Like, is this just flip a switch,
Sure.
or is this like we really have to go into the guts and figure it out?
I'd say it's in between, closer to this is just a switch. The video on this is public as far as I know, but they go over all of the code that it would take. So basically, if you already have an authentication system and you're already storing credentials securely, adding this just becomes maybe 20 lines of code.
Okay.
And that's a guess, but the API is pretty fleshed out, and all of the UI stuff is automatically handled by Safari. So all you have to do is handle detecting that the user has a device capable. There's a single call you can make from the API that'll tell your website that they're on a device that has Touch ID or has Face ID. And then you initiate, you do, like you said, you do the old school login or 2-factor authentication. And then after that, you offer them the option to add Face ID. And then once you've stored that as a server-side cookie, next time they come, you can just automatically default to Face ID if it's available. And obviously, you can offer a regular login if they're on their Mac and not on their phone. I like this idea a lot because of the secure enclave. Using Face ID to log into a site means 2-factor authentication isn't necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of happening automatically, right?
Right. Yeah, it's part and parcel of the authentication system. So like the PayPal app, I cannot get it to remember my device. Every time I log in, I can log in with Face ID, but then it wants to go 2-factor, and I have to wait for a text message to come. And it drives me nuts. That kind of thing, if it were properly implemented, especially through a web portal, which, as we talked about, sometimes you have to default to, it could be really nice.
I guess the one thing I'm wondering is, and I don't know the adoption rate. I don't know how much web surfing is being done through Safari on a Mac as opposed to how many people are using Chrome on a Mac, how many people are using Firefox, how many people are using Windows. I mean, Amazon's going to do this because Amazon has, a ton of developers, and they have a ton of money invested in making sure that it's as easy for me to spend money with Amazon as I possibly can. Big developers are going to do this is there any concern? Well, concern, I guess, is not really the right word because we're already living in a world that doesn't have this. Would you hazard a guess at adoption, or would you rather not? Would you rather just say, it's easy, I hope everybody does it, and all bets are off on how many will?
Do you mean like the chances that Chrome will offer Face ID?
Oh, no, quite the contrary. The chances that every website out there will go ahead and do this thing for a subset of a subset. I mean, the one thing that makes it possible to me is, with the exception of some people, I'm going to say, generally speaking, we all use Safari on our iPhones. If we're going on the web, not going to an app, we're using Safari. Now, I know there are other web browsers that you can use for your iPhone, but we're all going to Safari. That might be the kind of thing that gets a web developer to say, well, I need to go ahead and build that in. But if we're thinking in terms of the Mac, if we're thinking in terms of the desktop, really what I'm wondering is, websites from A to Z, what do you think the chances that, 51% or more go ahead and hop on?
If it's easy enough, I would, and I do think it's easy enough. I think that it would be to a website's benefit, even if it's only for Safari users. And I do think that it would drive some market share to Safari, but honestly, Safari does not have wide acceptance. It is not. Chrome is by far the more widely used browser, and if it could work synergistically, and more people switch to Safari just for the ease of login using their face, but I don't really see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, again, the one thing that I see is the possibility of, because it's on all the iPhones and all the iPads, because power users know they can use something else. Most people just say, oh, there's no app? Okay, I'll go to the website. And they're like conscious of, are they using, Chrome or Firefox or Safari or what have you. I got one last question for you. After concentrating on what Apple has done and what Apple did announce at WWDC, is there something more you'd like to see Apple do towards privacy and security? Or is there something you'd like to see them do in a way that they're not doing currently?
I like privacy. I advocate for it, but I'm not as smart about it as I should be. It seems like every time Apple adds new security features, I realize after the fact that I should have been concerned about that earlier.
Like the Clipboard thing.
Right. So I'm not the guy to be second guessing Apple's next move. They're way smarter people than me working on that. I still don't know where we stand with Siri recordings. There was a lawsuit or a whistleblower complaint.
Right.
It was a year or two ago now.
About a year ago, I think, as we record, yeah.
And it was a guy who had been listening to hundreds of hours of random snippets from people's lives, including family members and porn running on their computer. And basically, he felt like it was a huge invasion of privacy. Apple came out and said, okay, we are privacy focused. We're going to do better. They made it possible to delete all that data. You had to opt into sharing those recordings. But it kind of went silent after that. And it's the one thing that kind of freaks me out. Like, I know that Amazon is listening anywhere that I have an Echo. But do I have to worry about Siri?
It's really interesting because the way they explained it, I felt like that was the crash report. I felt like that. I mean, and I'm not. And here's the problem. Yes, I am also very privacy minded, but I also have this. One of my favorite lines from the movie JFK is one of the guys says to Jim Garrison, "How do you know who your daddy is? Because your mama told you so." At some point, you got to trust somebody, maybe. Now, I may be an idiot, and I may be the first one, when the Apple police come and knock on everybody's door. But I sort of felt like the way Apple explained the Siri thing, totally uncool that they didn't tell people ahead of time. Completely uncool they didn't tell people ahead of time. But once they explained it, I honestly did think of the crash report. I thought about they're telling me it's anonymized. They're telling me they might hear me say something embarrassing. They might also just hear me ask, Apple's virtual assistant for one thing, and it pops up with something completely different. So then a third pair of ears can go, assuming that, Sirius is the first, mine is the second. A third pair of ears can go, well, that sounded nothing like that. How do we go about tweaking or correcting? Yeah. Which, maybe I'm naive.
They clarified that there was no identifying data attached to it. It wasn't a change they made. It has always been that way.
Yeah.
And that is, to run an intelligent assistant that is accurate and can handle all kinds of inflections and accents, you're going to need humans to listen to some stuff and give it that third factor interpretation. Mm-hmm. So I'm not opposed to it. I do feel safe with what Apple said, but then I feel I'm just suspicious. And it's a nagging paranoia, because while I feel secure in everything that I intentionally do on my Mac, I know my Mac isn't watching and listening to me all the time. I don't know that about my watch and my phone, and it makes me paranoid.
Thanks again to Brett Terpstra for spending time with us today. If you'd like to know more about his work, maybe keep up with what's coming next, BrettTerpstra.com is the place to point your browser. That's BrettTerpstra, BrettTerpstra.com. And we will, of course, have a link to that in the show notes. You can also follow Brett, by the way, on Twitter, TTSCOFF. That is at TTSCOFF to keep up with Brett on Twitter. If you're looking for more security news and how-tos, the place to look is securemac.com/checklist. There you will find notes for today's show, for the last show, for all the shows we've done to this point, and any shows we do going forward. You can also listen to every one of them right there. It all starts at one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you would like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.